Hello, welcome to Spacemen Pod. I'm Ian Edmund,
And I'm Mark Lascelles.
and it's been a bit of a while since we've done one of our podcasts. We had that lovely run of chats that we had with Mark Rifoy a little while ago, but that's been over a month since then. We were all getting ready to put something together, but then unusually for the last year or so, we suddenly had a bit of illness in my house. Had a cold that was so nasty that a couple of the household did get tested for COVID, which it wasn't in the end, and that put us off because we were getting ready to record just when I couldn't really speak. And Mark, even worse in your direction, I think.
We had illness in my house, although I don't know whether I'd call it that. Was a case of seeing a football in the garden, thinking, "Oh yeah, I think I'll kick that." Next thing I know, I was flat on my front, cracked rib, and unable to even squeak, let alone speak for a podcast. So
Very
apologies,
nasty.
but
Kids,
self-inflicted.
kids, you will be old one day. Please take pity on us. It will come to you eventually. Right. Well, today I'm very grateful to Mark for a suggestion that you made a little while ago when you said, we'll have to talk about walking with Jesus one day. And I thought, I don't know, it's such a big song. It's such an important thing. Don't want to use up all the big hitters too early in our run. But then the more I thought about it, the more I absolutely couldn't resist because it's wonderful and such a central thing to the story. So today we're going to spend most of our time chatting about that. But there's little bits of news that we should make sure we've covered. We're recording
Indeed.
this near the end of August. And in the beginning of September, Pete Kember's coming over to the UK for the Sonic Boom gigs, which have been delayed at least once. I can't remember if it's more than that. So many things have been pushed around the schedules. It is at time of recording only about 2 or 3 weeks away. And one of those gigs is in Brighton, where I am. And I know one's not far from you as well.
One is in Leeds at the
It
Brew
is
now.
in Leeds,
Absolutely.
yes, absolutely. I have to confess, I'm still a little nervous and unsure how I feel about crowds.
Yes.
I don't know. I'd be lovely to see Pete. And of course, unlike previous tours, now that he's not living in the UK, they're a little rarer. And it'd be such a shame to miss that chance. So I very much hope that I'll feel brave enough when the time comes. All those dates are listed on the Sonic Boom Bandcamp site. That's probably the best place for you to go and find them rather than have us reel them all off again now. Also, Spiritualized reissue campaigns continuing apace. They've put the little promo clips up for the Ladies and Gentlemen one. It's probably worth mentioning now, something we sort of dithered about talking about before, because it was very early days. We didn't know if we were just seeing one or two exceptional cases, but there do seem to be quite a few people who've had problems with some of the vinyl pressing, especially the colour vinyl ones. I'm wondering if this is just a consequence of the fact that post-pandemic vinyl pressing plants seem to be in incredible demand.
Well, the backlog's enormous, isn't it?
Yeah, a few people we know who've got their own small labels complaining that they can't get anything done for months and months, or 6 month absolute minimum, often longer than that. Also, it seems that the costs have gone up and that people are being asked to pay more now than the original deals that were cut with them as well. So it's a terrible position for small labels. But this may be a consequence of that. And to the credit of Fat Possum, the company who are putting these reissues out, they seem to be doing their best to deal with it. So if you've got a Duff pressing and haven't had a chance to do anything about it, go and look them up and email the guy there, who I gather is extremely responsive, and they're doing their best. I'm sure no one's happy about this at the record company. I'm sure Jason's not happy about it, but it's one of those things. I heard a thing that said it seems to be depending on which plant they're coming from, because the
I think you're right.
original test pressings didn't seem to have these problems. But
Seems
there we
odd.
go.
Seems odd. I was going to say maybe the cassette industry is having such a revival it could take over.
I like cassettes, but even I'm not such a sad hipster that I have been suckered into buying new ones. In fact, there's a guy who might recognize himself, an old friend and massive Spacemen 3 fan who makes his own music, who I'd like to buy some more of his stuff from Bandcamp, but he seems to be a little bit hardcore and in terms of physical releases, and doesn't put them up for digital download only. There's one album I'd like to get from him. The only remaining way to buy it is to buy the cassette. To do that, I get the download free with it. Maybe I'll try and buy it and send a message saying, yeah, I bought it, but you can keep the cassette. You know, it will only take up a bit of space over
Oh,
here.
God. I still have a working cassette deck, incredibly, but
Oh, yeah.
doesn't get used much.
No, I've not
Must be
quite been
honest.
able to bring myself to dispose of the fairly substantial stack of cassettes I've got. And, you know, sad enough collector that the old Spacemen 3 ones are just lovely artifacts to have themselves.
Yeah.
Although they sort of broke my collecting bug in a way for everything. It's not come back in the way it was, because for many years it was the glass cassette of The Perfect Prescription. For some reason, I set up as being like my holy grail, probably because it was so hard to find. And then one came up on eBay and it came up fairly cheap and no one noticed, and I got it fairly cheap. And
Hey.
there it was in my hands, and suddenly it wasn't such a big deal anymore. You know, it was the chase, I think, rather than the actual having of it that was the thing. I don't think I've played it, which I should do, because it's you know, twice it's got a whole extra side of extra stuff, although it's just previously released. Anyway, there we go. And another thing which only got posted this morning by Will Carruthers, he's got some of his lino cut artwork as part of a display that is happening at a gallery in Hoxton. It's at the exhibition's called Tilt 2021, Hoxton Gallery Summer Show. I'll put a link to this in the page for the podcast on the site. It opens on the 20th of August, closes on the 5th of September, so fairly short run. But if you're in the area, go along and have a look at that. I mean, you can see examples of Will's art, I think, on his Patreon site. And we've mentioned this before, but it's a good, you get a good deal if you sign up for his Patreon, and depending on what level you're at, sometimes that includes bits of this art, but it's often up there for sale anyway. So yeah, go and check that out. I'm wondering if Will's part of that exhibition in any way linked to the fact that the only time I've ever been to Hoxton Square was for a gig that we'll talk about later in this episode, where Will
So-called
had,
reunion.
well, indeed, I think we should probably slightly shy away from actually calling it a reunion, but it was a
A
collection
gathering of friends.
yes, exactly. But as part of that show, there was an exhibition of Natty's artwork there. So, you know, Will's obviously got his connections in that area. Well, we're going to talk about Walking with Jesus today, a song which was around from the very early days of Spacemen 3, one that was played throughout their career in some of the earliest shows, right up to some of the later ones as well, went through all sorts of transformations. But I thought we'd start off just talking about the content of the song and the lyrics, because this is almost entirely a Jason Pierce composition. So it's Jason that will be our main focus today. There were some contributions from Pete, and we'll talk about those when they come up. But one of the things that we said right at the start of our first podcast is that we didn't want to be talking about Spaceman 3 and going on about drugs all the time. And we still want to try and stick to that as much as we can. But there are times when it's a bit unavoidable, and this has got to be one of them, because in that sort of famous what were they trying to do, document their lives and what they saw about them, this has got to be the key example of that, really.
Yeah, I would agree.
It doesn't necessarily mean that it was Jason who wrote most of the lyrics that was actually necessarily experiencing any of this himself, and it's not for us really to speculate beyond what he might have said in public. So it's going to be, you know, in terms of the narrator of the song. But anyway, kicks off, I walked with Jesus, and he would say, although from the beginning we can say that that was not the way it was originally done. There's some handwritten lyrics, which I think is Jason's hand, where you can see that the walking, both in the first line and the title, has been overwritten with a W, and that originally it was talking. So I was walking or talking with Jesus, and he would say, oh, you poor child, you ain't coming to me no way. So we're getting that sort of moral slant on the fact that whatever's going on is not something which should really be approved on. And Jason talked about this in various interviews.
It's kind of a man not exactly challenging his conscience, but certainly questioning part of it, I think.
He said in an interview in the NME in April 92, he said, on the first Spaceman album, I was lifting bits of old songs and lyrics. Walking with Jesus off the second LP was the first time I wrote my own words and questioned what I was doing in a massive way. When I did that song, I was doing a lot of stuff to myself. Drugs, do you want a list? And it's very hard to be doing all that and to be happy without becoming very questioning. All of it was against everything I've been brought up to believe. So he's casting Jesus there as, I guess, the moral authority, making it clear whether what he's doing is the right thing or not. I mean, he did say about that in a Melody Maker interview in February 98. He said that wasn't a religious song. Jesus is just one of a very few moral characters, and that song has to do with breaking moral codes.
That's
Everything
right.
you've been brought up to believe is right and good being turned around by something that's happened to you growing up. You know, obviously there's a huge amount of religious imagery throughout the whole of Spacemen 3 canon, but I mean, that's as clear an indication as you need that it's an allegorical thing, really. So what's Jesus's problem? You found heaven on earth, going to burn for your sins, but I think I'll be in good company down there with all my friends. I mean, that's completely the documenting your times and your experiences, isn't it?
Yeah, I think also around that time, the BBC did an Everyman documentary about LSD, and there were a lot of religious connotations in terms of a lot of the people were taking it in order to, this is back in the 60s and even earlier, they were taking it to have some kind of religious experience. And the people who had claimed to have had religious experiences without the use of LSD were, I remember one of the guys said, taking LSD to get yourself into the presence of God is barging into the presence of God. And I always thought that was quite an interesting stance on that, that if you're actually going to find yourself at that kind of level of consciousness, but you've done it without the use of prayer or artificially, somebody from a religious point of view might find that as effectively cheating.
Oh, interesting.
I don't agree with that, I have to say. But I always thought it was quite an interesting point of view, because a lot of people do have religious experiences on psychedelics. I mean, I know this song tends to refer to drugs in general. I was kind of leaned towards the psychedelic side, that even though that possibly wasn't the main thing that they were up to.
I think with this song, you could, like so much of it, sort of relate it to whatever experience you fancy. And that's one of the things we'll talk about with the lyrics, the way that they were changed a bit to make it a bit more non-specific, which really I think has been one of Jason's ways of operating throughout his whole career, really, you know, to maybe have an influence or two, but try and present it in a way that you can attach all sorts of meanings and find it in from other sensations. But there's not a lot of doubting here, because the original lyrics specifically name-checked a particular drug. Well, that's really interesting what you said, because that ties in so nicely to where we get to next. You know, what's Jesus's problem? I've got around to thinking about what Jesus said to me, because if heaven's like this, then that's the place to be. I mean, that's exactly the collision of religious experience and drug use. And then what's to be done about that? Long time between now and my death. I've got to have my fun, so I've chosen what's best. I mean, it makes it very clear that it is something that the narrator has thought about, made a choice, considered the options, and if heaven's like this, then there's not really any alternative. And then depending on which version you're listening to, this may be the first time we get, well, here it comes, sound of confusion, sound of love. So although this is a majority Jason Pierce song, that chorus is contributed by Pete Kember. And I don't know quite exactly what he was meaning by it, but considering it is a heroin song, and that early lyric of if heaven's like this was originally if heaven's like heroin.
The Rush.
Yeah, I'm imagining that by here it comes, it's a coming on feeling. And sound of confusion, I can only assume, is meant to be, not entirely sure about this, it's all a little bit chaotic and overwhelming and bewildering, but then it settles down into the feelings that were being aimed for, and now it's the sound of love.
That chorus for me probably kind of epitomizes everything about Spacemen 3 in terms of the way that their music hit me, because it's very distorted, and a lot of people find it quite unpleasant at times when they really get guitar mashing. But the sound of confusion was such a perfect phrase to describe their music, and the way that those lyrics, here comes the sound, and it's like the anticipation, it just sums everything up for me. I think it's they couldn't have encapsulated where they were coming from better than that chorus.
I would be amazed if there's anyone listening to this who's not already a massive Spaceman 3 fan. But on the off chance that anyone's listening and thinking, why are you getting so excited? All these lyrics are very straightforward. They're very basic. What you said there is exactly it. It's the well-chosen phrase, and it's the economy as well. In the course of a few verses, Jason in particular here gets over all of the feelings that are surrounding this experience just so incredibly well.
He could also sing it in several different ways, so that sometimes he sounded kind of fragile and almost desperate, and other times he sounded comforted and confident, depending on how he actually delivered that "here comes the sound" and "here it comes." It was sometimes he'd kind of push it up and he'd go up a few notes, or sometimes he'd go down, and it was
well, we've got all the recorded versions to have a whiz through in a moment, and that's definitely something that makes a completely different attitude to the whole way it's being delivered and received as a result of that. Well, anyway, we get I think our final verse. So listen, sweet Lord, forgive me my sins, because I can't stand this life without all of these things. It's just that, again, that you're going to have to get over it. That acceptance that this is the way it's been gone. And then a couple of lines which you've already said you think that the sound of confusion, sound of love epitomizes everything. I think in the next few lines, Jason comes up with a couplet which is, for me, the distillation of almost everything about Spaceman 3, when he says, no, I've done wrong, but I've heaven on earth. No, I've done wrong, but I could have done me worse. And I think it's that last little bit, no, I've done wrong, but I could have done me worse, that just seems to sum up so much of what they're about, really. That, acknowledgement that they're not perfect by any means, but at the same time, is this something that should get the level of persecution that it was, especially at this point in the 80s? It's just a nice summation of a statement of intent, but at the same time, slight resignation.
But as you say, I can't quite believe that they came out with a song as blatant as this at that particular time, because I remember that whole heroin shadow over the UK and all those ads on the TV and all that stuff, and it was so frowned upon. I mean, drug use anyway, but particularly heroin. People really despised it and despised heroin users. So for them to come out with this was nothing short of remarkable.
This is very much the peak of the heroin screws you up campaign, which anyone of our age in the UK will remember. The posters of poor disheveled people, curled up in balls or literally sitting in gutters. And I mean, I should make it very clear, we're not advocating heroin use. No. Please don't feel that you should go out and try it. Sorry, I mean, I have never tried heroin, and probably expect that I never will. And in a way, I feel that Spacemen 3 have done it for me.
Maybe when I had a general anaesthetic, that might have been the closest I've been.
I guess so. Because sometimes when I plug into some of this music, I sort of feel that I've got the feeling and don't feel any need to have to explore it anymore, which I know is something that they've said was sort of the point as well at times. So
I think that also links back to the fact that Spacemen 3 were a band that very much linked with their audience. That's certainly what I felt when I used to go to the gig. So if they are singing about heroin in this song, as Pete Kember said, this could be interpreted for pretty much any drug, and you can, if you were taking drugs and you had this kind of attitude, you probably had this kind of discussion with your conscience or something similar anyway. So it was a very familiar thing for a lot of Spacemen 3 fans at that time.
Then we've got the little coda that wraps things up. Jesus, please meet me at the center of the earth, because these wings are going to fail me, but I could have done me worse. It's a lovely summary, although it's missing from a lot of the versions. It was written, as we'll talk about in a mo, right at the beginning when the song was first done, but it doesn't really make an appearance again until the final album, Perfect Prescription version. But I've always loved that little coda. I think it's a lovely little summary. There are a couple of active Spacemen 3 Facebook groups, and in the run-up to the recording of the episode, I asked if anyone had Walking with Jesus as a particular favourite, and a few people got in touch. One of those was Pete Hughes, and Pete was kind enough to share some of his thoughts on the song with us.
Walking with Jesus, why is it my favourite Spacemen 3 song? I think it was my main introduction really to Spacemen 3. I'd heard Hypnotised, I think, on Smub TV, which were late 80s, early 90s indie show on BBC Two, and it blew me away. So I nicked around with my paper round money to Our Price in Doncaster, picked out a Spacemen 3 album and ended up with The Perfect Prescription. Very excited. Totally different to Hypnotise, but Walking with Jesus was the song that really stuck out on first listen because it's like a hymn in 2 chords. I'd always been attracted to the idea of punk, that anyone should be able to do it, but I wasn't particularly attracted to the sound. I think you've got to be in a certain mood, and I'm not a particularly angry person all the time. And I think Walking with Jesus showed me that you could make very soulful music, spiritual music, just using 2 chords. And the lyrics as well, I think stood out to me because they're just, it's that Spaceman 3 thing, or particularly Jason thing of the matching the religious experience and the psychedelic experience that has some kind of appeal to me. And it's stuck with me ever since. It's been a massive influence to me when I was learning to play musical instruments myself. It spurred me on because it was a song that I could play, but 2 chords, and it sounds great, and it always sounds great. It's an absolute classic to me, and I would imagine that I've probably listened to it every week for the last 30 years, to be honest.
Cheers, Pete. Great to hear from you. It's one of these songs. When we were talking in one of the previous podcasts about transparent radiation, it was really interesting to go through all the little versions we've got on different albums and compilations. But it turned out when I listened to them really closely that quite a lot of them were the same version at different stages of completion, different mixes, different bits dubbed onto them. And we've got quite a few versions of Walking with Jesus, but as far as I can make out, they're all different, which is brilliant because we can see an evolution and what the band were trying to do with it at different points in its life. Now, I don't know for sure that I've got all of these in the order that they were recorded. I think I have, but it's a bit of guesswork going on because, you know, the Spacemen catalogue's not tremendously well documented. But we certainly know that the first version, the first recorded version we've got, is from the 1984 demo tape, which was eventually released as For All the Fucked Up Children of the World, We Give You Spacemen 3. That's a very unusual version considering what comes afterwards, isn't it, Mark?
It is. It is very sort of Muddy Waters, Manish Boy, blues slide. A lot of the songs on those demos had that bluesy feel.
Uh-huh.
And it is fairly remarkable to think that within a year, everything had changed.
Yeah. It would be really interesting if we'll ever get to hear someday anything they were doing earlier than this. I mean, there wasn't much they were doing. I don't know that anyone would have recorded the very first gigs. There have been a few gigs before this because, of course, this demo tape is a 3-piece lineup of Jason, Pete and Natty. There's no bass player, although they had a bass player. Pete Bain had been a member of the band before this, before leaving with Tim Morris to go off and join another band for a bit. And we don't really know what that sounded like. So I wonder if there was anything different before this. But anyway, as you say, it has got this slidey blues feel. The vocal line's very different. You know, it hasn't really settled down to the one we know. But this is the absolutely unequivocally blatant heroin version. There's a couple of lines which got changed after this. If heaven's like heroin, that's supposed to me, and can't stand my life without sweet heroin. Pete said in an interview in the Spacemen 3 fanzine Outer Limits that those were lines that he contributed. So he says, I put the chorus in later and also the line, listen, sweet Lord, please give me a sing, so I can't send this life without sweet heroin, and another one, because if heaven's like heroin, then that's the place for me. Jason wanted to take the heroin references out. He very occasionally sing them live. Basically, he chickened out. He didn't like being so specific or whatever. Partly that, and he wanted it so it could be perceived as being about a much wider range of experiences and or drugs. I don't know if Pete would stick to the way that came across in the way he said that these days, because I don't think it's right to say that Jason chickened out when he changed them. I think it really is that it's been made universal. I think it's the sort of thing, as you were saying, Mark, when they're connecting with their audience, the audience know what they're saying. So it's a little bit of a nod and a wink when the words aren't explicitly there. Why do you need to say it? The people who know, they know. And it means that you won't get lots of sensationalist hassle from everyone who ever hears the song otherwise.
Particularly now, when you think of the comparative success that they've both had since those days, and the idea of Spiritualized being on stage at the Royal Albert Hall using those heroin lyrics, I can't see that going down terribly well with the general public.
Absolutely. But it's quite a version, isn't it? I mean, they were obviously still finding their way. Apart from OD Catastrophe, none of the songs sounded like that by the time they got finally recorded. And indeed, that particular version of OD Catastrophe will come into our Walking with Jesus story, because the next one that we've got is the Northampton demo recorded.
That's right, but Taking Drugs.
Yeah, the one that was released on Taking Drugs, absolutely. And by this point, it's changed to sound a lot more like the version that we would all know. It's much faster. It's got a much more guitar-heavy attack. We've now got a bass player as well. But even so, even though there's a bass player on that version, it's still very trebly. It's very high end, isn't it? But I have to say, I find that almost a little bit too trebly. The fuzzes, it's a bit, presumably Cramp's influences.
I'm sure.
Is the thing
there's,
doing that?
It's very raw. And
very raw indeed,
the fact that Jason's vocals pushed quite a long way to the front of that. I mean, it's big vocals on that version.
Yeah. And by this time, the lyrics have changed to the ones that are the ones we'll know throughout most of the versions. You know, Heavens Like This, it's a bit more non-specific. There's an interesting thing about that, though. When the feedback comes in towards the end, that feedback is dubbed on. It wasn't recorded as part of that.
I hadn't realised that.
Yeah, well, I had this pointed out to me by someone who was around at the time not long ago. It's going back to the version of OD Catastrophe that's on that 1984 demo tape, at the time still called TV Catastrophe, slightly betraying its Stooges origin a bit there. The feedback's on that demo tape.
So it's the same feedback?
Whether it was actually recorded separately from the TV Catastrophe and dubbed onto that, I don't know. But when you listen to it, once you're aware of it, you can't miss it. I didn't know for a long time, but once you know
I
it,
must
you
admit,
cannot
I
miss
haven't
it.
spotted that.
It's exactly the same feedback.
Goodness me.
Yeah. In fact, it doesn't only appear on that. There's the famous story about those Northampton demos that Pete Bain wasn't happy with the version of 235 that had feedback on.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And,
he wanted to take it off.
So therefore they did remove it. And on the original vinyl issue of those demos, there's only the non-feedback version. And now that we've had reissues since then, we've got the feedback version as well. Well, listen to the feedback on the feedback version. It's the same feedback.
Wow, that's interesting.
So it's been used all over the place there.
You also pointed out that there's some bits which they sort of pinched from a band called the Five Americans.
Absolutely. Again, this is something which, again, I had no idea about, but someone recently said, have a listen to this. There's a track called the Five Americans called
I See the Light.
Thank you. Yes, well, see that. Absolutely. It's on YouTube. We'll definitely put a link to it.
That is just extraordinary.
And this wasn't
fantastic
there in that original demo version, but now we've got to this stage in the game. Well, you listen to that Five American song and it's going do 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 all the way through. So would they have heard it? It's unlikely that they hadn't. I think it was on one of the Nuggets compilations.
Yeah, they were listening to a lot of those things.
Although
I
don't think it was on the original vinyl version of Nuggets, but there was a 1986 American CD thing, just a selection of tracks which did include that as well. Or of course they or one of their friends might have had the original, circles they were mixing.
A hell of a lot of music, those guys.
They're very musically literate, and the different people who came along and gave them different influences. Yeah, I mean, it's probably floating around rugby somewhere there. So yeah, there's probably a little lift there. But as you say, it is raw, isn't it? And I actually find some of those early ones probably a little bit sacrilegious. I find some of them just a little bit too raw to be comfortable sometimes. I mean, the one that really does it for me, moving away from Walking with Jesus a bit, the Sound of Confusion album version of Amen / Hey Man. When it gets to the choruses on that, the guitar that's doing the drone there, it sounds to me like an old badly maintained car driving along the road, the exhaust pipe having fallen off and it's dragging along the road. It's just sort of aggressive and uncontrolled drone. I mean, look, they're obviously great.
Sounds good.
It's harsh at times. Well, I think they must have known this because they decided that Walking with Jesus was going to be their first single. And before even thinking of it as a single, of course, it was going to be recorded for the first album, for Sound of Confusion, because at the time of when they recorded the Northampton demos, that time the song was still called Sound of Confusion. So it was going to be the title track for the album.
Right. Yeah, of course.
But the story is that it just didn't work when they tried to record it. Yeah. There's a few quotes about this. Well, there's some stuff that was in Eric Morse's Spacemen 3 book.
Oh, yeah.
He says whether it was the overproduction or Jason's inability to lay down a solid vocal, Walking with Jesus, Sound of Confusion was abandoned despite being the title track. The song just didn't work for us. It just wasn't happening, said Sonic. So we had to ditch Sound of Confusion. Definitely one of our better tracks, and which we'd already decided to call the album. And an interesting thing about that, when you consider the huge amount of Spacemen 3 material that's been issued since they broke up, all the demo tapes we've had, all the little rehearsal sessions which have been circulating amongst bootleggers, and I think this Sound of Confusion version of Walking with Jesus is something that I'm not aware of ever having heard, or anyone having heard. Yeah, so that would be really interesting. I mean, maybe we'll be disappointed if they were unhappy with it and didn't think it was worth releasing. Maybe we'll think the same, but it'd still be fascinating to actually hear it.
Mm-hmm.
So they went back to the same studio that they did the Northampton demos. It's a little unclear from some of the interviews whether their intention was to try and do another version there, or whether they were just going straight in to remix the demo version, which eventually got released as a single. But one way or the other, that's what happened. And it is remixed quite nicely, actually. I mean, it's still pretty aggressive, but it doesn't feel quite as raw and harsh. Jason's vocals in particular have got an extra oomph behind them. I think they've increased the reverb on them, haven't they?
They have. They've also toned down the treble a little bit, I think, which was one of the things with the Northampton demo, which is possibly not tinny. That's not right, but the on the single, it sounds slightly less bright, and I think a little bit more controlled.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, definitely. But it is the same recording. Mm-hmm. They did also edit it a bit. There's just a few seconds of intro sliced off the beginning, but there's a couple of minutes taken off the end. It's substantially shorter than the full Northampton demo, which is a little bit ironic, therefore, that when Tang were putting together their compilation of all these singles for the US market, they seem to have used the original Northampton demo in its entire duration and unmixed state, rather than the version that was actually released as a single. And the reason that's such a shame is because they shaved a few minutes off the middle of Roller Coaster.
Yeah, I was going to say those 2 minutes which they included at the end of Walking with Jesus could have been the 2 minutes which they cut out of Roller Coaster.
I think it would still have been a bit of a push to get the whole lot on one CD. They might have still had to edit something, but yeah, they could easily have got another couple of minutes of it on there.
No, that's a major no-no. I still can't quite believe that they did that. And in fact, I don't think that was realized until I can't remember whether I mentioned it to Pete, but I suddenly noticed that the version seemed to be substantially shorter in the actual track listing, and this didn't make any sense, and he wasn't happy.
Well, of course, that didn't happen when Fire put out their compilation of the Glass singles as Translucent Flashbacks. They used the right version. They didn't edit Roller Coaster, but it is too long for a single CD if you take all of those first 3 EPs. I mean, the decision that they made was to leave off Things Will Never Be the Same. But it is the same version as Perfect Prescription, but it runs at a slightly different speed. So I don't know. Is it a big deal? You've got to make a choice somewhere.
They made a video for Walking with Jesus for the single version, didn't they?
They did. They made a video that went with that remix single version, and they're obviously going for whatever trippy effects they can do.
They just set up every projection light they could possibly find.
It's already recorded. So what is going on? I have to say, it's not very easy to see and work out what it is. It is 4-piece band.
It's psychedelic.
They've got all of their projectors going wildly all over them in the first place. And then on top of that, they've got video feedback effects. This is the effect you get if you point a video camera at its own monitor and you get the video equivalent of feedback. This is the effect that was used to create the original 1960s Doctor Who title sequences. The sort of swirling effects were done by pointing a camera at its own monitor. Since this has been done in colour, and it seems to be green that's favoured there, well, it is very psychedelic, but as a result, it's pretty much overwhelmed the entire image, and you can't really...
Is that on YouTube?
It is on YouTube. Yes, we'll put a link into that so you can
definitely have a look at that.
Make your own things out of it.
Much you can take.
It is the band are there. You can catch them from time to time. I mean, Jason's at the front on the right, Pete's at the front on the left. Not entirely sure if Pete's even playing a guitar. It's so unclear quite what's going on. And occasionally it pans back and you can see Pete being there, and Roscoe is there as well in one of their first engagements with the band, because of course it was Natty playing on that single, but Natty had left by the time it was released. But yeah, interesting video, very homemade.
Yeah, that was inevitably the first Spacemen 3 record I bought, but I didn't buy it for Walking with Jesus. I bought it for Feel So Good on the other side because somebody had played me that and I fell in love with it. So Walking with Jesus hit me later.
I mean, it was great for you and for other people who were clued up enough to get it at the time, because it was impossible to get almost straight away.
Yeah, it was. It did take me a while to find it, I remember. Worth tracking down.
Those early singles are just so rare for so many years, and we're lucky that everything's been compiled now, really. So after the single release, it's quite a while until we get to the next officially released version. But in between, there were various practices and rehearsal sessions and demos, which, thanks to some of the things that have been issued in more recent years, we've now got the ability to enjoy. And I think the next one that we can hear is from a rehearsal in February 1987. And this version of Walking with Jesus from that rehearsal's been released on the Losing Touch with Your Mind compilation, which I think is a brilliant compilation. I mean, it's a bootleg, but it managed to find its way into a lot of record shops in the UK. I bought my copy from HMV.
But it's a bootleg with some of the details on the actual CD itself crossed out in marker pen. It's just that the editions I've got, because I'm getting them fairly early on, and for instance, they were numbered, but the number is just a very crude piece of sticker which has been cut into some random shape and stuck on when somebody's handwritten the number. So they were very odd.
I mean, they are alternative versions, most of them. Some of them are only just alternative versions. I mean, the Mix of Honey is so incredibly close to the final version that you'd have to listen very hard to tell the difference. But actually, because of the fact that it's got so many of the key songs on it in really pretty good versions, it's a good starting place if you want to convert anyone who wants to know what it's all about. Anyway, the version on Walking with Jesus on there, it's still heavy like the single, but it's heavy in a different way. I think
that's a cracking version. That
it's moved on from. I mean, in the single and the Northampton demo, it sounds like they're having a lot of fun making it, almost like they can't believe they're actually in a studio properly making things, and it's all everyone's G'd up, and well, it doesn't sound like they're on heroin on that day. It sounds like they might have taken a few stimulants. It's all let's go. For this one, it's still very heavy, but it's. What's the word I'm after? It's another word for heavy. Yeah, it's got substance. It's got ballast and dynamism.
It's also got that lovely little kind of reverb Spacemen 3 signature wobble going through it, that little buzz.
And it's one of the best examples of it, I think, you'll find on any recording. And I just love the fact that, I mean, because it was a rehearsal and they weren't intending to make it a proper release, I love at the very beginning, the little bits where people are there's a little bit of bass wobbling about and guitars getting ready, and then suddenly that massive thick guitar drone comes in, and it's just so impressively recorded, and I just adore it. It's definitely one of my favorite versions. Jason's vocals are much more direct and self-assured. It's
to break a bit towards
the end. It's a really confident performance. Well, that is true. Right at the very end, the vocals go a bit.
That's the delivery, isn't it?
Some of the guitars on there, and the drums are terribly recorded. It sounds like someone banging on a biscuit tin. But I would have to say, who cares? It's just so dynamic.
It's got that vibe, isn't it?
Incredibly impressive, and I absolutely adore it. Not available anywhere else, as far as I'm aware. Although that practice session that it comes from has really, really been plundered. That's the same practice session that had what became known as the organ version of Transparent Radiation. It's got 235 version 2, as it was called, on some of the Taking Drugs reissues. And I think something else that I can't remember at the moment as well. But this one only on that Losing Touch compilation, which, unlike a lot of the other semi-official at best releases from the time, doesn't seem to have got absorbed into the main canon. So not necessarily that easy to get hold of, unfortunately. After that, we head into a whole load of demo versions, which we've been able to hear because of the releases of things like Forged Prescriptions. I think the next one chronologically is the version that's on the second disc of Forged Prescriptions.
That's right.
It's still got that drone, hasn't it? It's still got that background thick drone all the way through. But the general tone of the piece is just getting a little bit lighter.
Yeah, they've taken the foot off the pedal a little bit. works beautifully, but
it does.
it's just
You can see the direction they're heading in with it. I mean, Jason's, I think, strumming on an acoustic for the first time in any of these ones, and doing some nice little picking out of notes as well. It's still quite fast, but yeah, we're starting to see it come down a little bit. And we wouldn't have had any sort of bridge towards the versions that ended up on the Perfect Prescription. It would have gone straight from this getting more calm but still fairly full on, if it weren't for the fact that we've got a sort of intermediate version on How the Blues Should Have Turned Out, the second disc of that. I feel you have to take full credit.
Well, that was one of a series of disagreements I had with Pete when we were compiling that album. I think that Pete thought that there had been enough versions of Walking with Jesus out there for people to not really need any more. But I thought that this one was so nice. It was so kind of delicate. That most of the guitar seems to have gone. There's the organ seems to be at the fore, and it was such a nice link between the other versions that were around that I argued for its inclusion, and there it is. So I'm proud of that one.
Yeah, I think we're very grateful for that. I can sort of see Pete's point of view. It is a song for which there are a lot of versions out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would make sense where he's coming from. But certainly your perspective is the one I'm very glad one out there, because it's a bridge, isn't it? It's the first one that you can say is getting properly serene. It's the first one that's completely organ driven, and the guitars are now taking their place, helping to fill things out rather than being the dominating factor. And it's lovely. And Jason's
slower tempo.
Yeah, calming the vocals down a bit more as well. It's really lovely. And yeah, a shame that isn't a little more widely available, because those compilations were exceedingly limited, mail order things only, and some of the tracks have been subsequently sort of collected up and put out on Space Age, but not that one, unfortunately. There was that DJ Tones EP, which was largely made up of stuff from those compilations.
It was. So that's an essential release for anybody who doesn't have it.
Oh yeah, I mean, originally just put out on Space Age on CD, but Don Martin's label, Great Pop Supplement, put out a vinyl version as well. I'm afraid I've no idea how readily available any of these things are. I imagine the vinyl's pretty collectible. They tend to go pretty quickly.
More readily available than the How the Blues CDs, I think.
Well, that's definitely true. I mean, like a lot of these things, people have uploaded some of them to YouTube, and we'll have a look around. And if this is there, then we'll put a link to it, of course. But it is a lovely little bridging version. And the final one we've got to show the development before we end up at the Perfect Prescription is the one that's on the first disc of Forged Prescriptions. And now it's really a completely organ-driven affair, and the organ is being phased really nicely. The whole thing's being phased, isn't it? Continually all the way through. And that's really a sort of soporific, enveloping version.
It's so different. I mean, there were endless delays with Forged Prescriptions, and at the time I wondered if it was ever going to come out. I was so desperate to hear the music that was on it, because we'd all heard this stuff about how they'd made Perfect Prescription different because they felt that the songs as they had originally recorded them couldn't be performed live. And for me, this is the absolute example of this. There's no way you could perform this version of Walking with Jesus live. It just couldn't be done. It doesn't work like that. And it's not only completely different, it's, for me, this is my favorite version, having been completely addicted to the one on Perfect Prescription. When this came out, I was floored. It was so beautiful. Jason's vocals were so different, and this is one of the ones where he kind of plays down the "Here it comes" line. He's relaxed about it. There's no desperation. He sounds confident, and there's something about his vocal delivery on this that sends tingles down my spine every time I hear it.
It is completely different to any other version in that respect, isn't it? I mean, even the melody line's completely different.
Yeah,
he's singing in a completely different way to the way we become accustomed to on all the ones up to now, and then it goes back to the original arrangement on Perfect Prescription. But it's a really interesting experiment. Yeah,
almost under his breath some of the time. It's
very relaxed, isn't it? Yeah,
wonderful.
And I know what you mean about the excitement from it, because like many of us, I'm sure, our enthusiasm for things sort of ebbs and flows. And I think before Forged Prescriptions came out, I probably had a year or so of not giving as much attention to Spacemen 3 as I would have done previously, and instantly I started playing that. it all came back so much more. And that song is key to it. It's the second song, isn't it? First of all, you've got that incredible Things Will Never Be the Same, which doesn't sound very different to the album version. In fact, it's slightly less finished than the album version. But the thing that hit me within seconds of putting that CD on was just how brilliant it sounds. It's just so clear and crisp, like it could have been recorded yesterday.
But it does make you wonder how those takes were actually recorded, because you couldn't have got Jason to do the take on the demo on Forged Prescriptions on the first disc and then say, right, we're going to do a different version now and do the way that he actually does it on the finished Perfect Prescription.
We know that they were in the studios for months and months and months. Yeah, so for anyone who hasn't heard the story before, that they were looking to record the album, and VHS Studios in Rugby were wanting to upgrade their 8-track soundboard to a 16-track. So Spacemen 3 said, well, we'll give you some money towards the desk if you give us studio time in exchange. And I think that seemed like quite a good deal to the studio at the time. I don't think what they hadn't really anticipated was quite how much time the band were going to take up in exchange. And they were there for such a long time. And they've told stories about how a lot of the recordings were done to a backdrop of endless supplies of hash. And which is why some of the early versions that were circulating amongst traders were called the Out of It sessions. Going back to what you were saying, I think we were expecting when Forged Prescriptions came out that it was just going to be a reproduction of those Out of It demos. And some of them are the same versions, but some of them are completely new and unheard. And this version, this organ version of Walking with Jesus is one of them. I don't think anyone had suspected that before. So I just remember when I first heard it, after first of all, the thrill and the clarity of that Things Will Never Be the Same. And then this came on and I thought, bloody hell, there's 2 more discs of this. Is it all going to be this sort of revelation? And it is. It's absolutely gorgeous. And at the time, I did think that probably it was worth the price of the whole set on its own. I do still adore it, but I'm going to come back to this when we've got through the last version and say why I'm not going to count it as one of the 2 versions I think are the real definitive. Which brings us on to the final step, because we've seen in those last few organ-driven versions how things have gone from the sort of full-on assault of the February '87 rehearsal, and it's calmed down more and more and more. And by the time we get to the Perfect Prescription, it is sort of barely there.
It's so laid back, isn't it?
So incredibly softly driven. I mean, it's still organ-driven, but even the organ has been taken down a notch. The bass is now got a clarity that it's never had before, probably just because it's not fighting with anything else. And this is a good point to say that bass line is absolutely phenomenal and really helps to make that song. I've no idea whether it's something that Jason wrote or Pete Bain wrote. There's an interview that Pete Kember did with a French fanzine called Upside Down in 1990. And this probably sounds a little bit odd because it's been double translated. But the question was, so you write music for all instruments? He says, no, it's complicated. It's not like classical music. We only write the lyrics and the tune, the guitar, and the rest of the band plays. Jason wrote the lyrics for the verses of Walking with Jesus, and I took care of those in the chorus. He composed the melody, to which I only added the hum of the guitars. You can't say it's writing something. It was just one note. So, he's saying that his contribution really was that phenomenal drone that runs through the early ones, and presumably he's now taken on the organ duties to do the same thing in these ones. From that, it's a little unclear when he says, we write the main bits and the others write their parts, seems to be what he's saying. So it could well have been a Pete Bain bass line. Having said that, there's a little bit of evidence of it being played in an early live version that we'll talk about shortly, where Pete's not in the band, but that doesn't mean he might come up with it before he left. Or maybe, I don't think it actually matters particularly, and the playing of it is great there. And we've talked about the dedication that people need to have to play some of this stuff in the past, but on this really quiet version, that really sticks out for me with the bass line because it's so exposed. It would reveal faults very easily. And well, there aren't any. It's just lovely. It's there all the way through that. It's even there when the organ drops. When the guitars drop out near the end. It's just down to organ and bass, just before Jason comes back with "Forgive Me, Sweet Lord," and it's just a centering moment.
His vocals are almost desperate in that version. He
They really
sounds
are.
almost on the edge. His delivery so, well, fragile is a good word for it.
Well, I think I'll say now about, I mean, I loved listening to all of those versions. And while we were getting ready to do this, I put a playlist of all of them together. And I thought it'd be a bit of a struggle to get through that a few times to familiarize myself with them all. But it was an absolute joy. And I haven't got at all bored of it. I mean, yeah, perhaps could have missed off the alternate mix of the 1984 demo, because as far as I can see, it is identical to the original
it does
one.
seem
On there.
very, very similar, doesn't
I
it?
wonder if whoever was putting out these CDs just felt that it would seem like a rip-off without a few more tracks on there. So very slightly.
They did used to play quite a few tunes twice live. So.
Yeah, that's true. But it hasn't been a chore at all. It's been an absolute joy. They're all great to listen to for all the reasons I think we said. But if I were to come down to two versions that I can't really choose between, because they're both coming at it from such a different angle. And the first one is that February 87 rehearsal. It's so powerful. It's so self-assured. And that thing you were saying at the beginning about what meaning the lyrics are imbibed with, it comes down to the way it's being performed. And on that rehearsal one, Jason sounds so confident that it's like the conversation between the narrator and Jesus is sort of, yeah, I know you're telling me I shouldn't be doing this. I know I'm doing wrong things, but I know what I'm doing. It's fine. You know, I can handle it, as it were. You know, it's the arrogance of youth, of thinking you know exactly what you're doing and that everything is fine. And because of that, I think it just gives it that extra layer of power that I don't think there's, for example, in the Northampton demo and 12-inch single version. When they're fine, but they don't sound to me like they're being narrated by someone who's living it. And in that 87 rehearsal, it really feels to me this is coming from someone who knows what they're talking about. By the time we get to the perfect prescription, I think the same thing for a different reason. This now feels a little bit less sure of itself. And this is all rather helped by the fact I think that Jason sounds like he might have a slight cold at the beginning, as if the meaning is now a little bit of a, no, it's okay, I've just got a cold. Perhaps the narrator now feels that perhaps things have gone a bit too far, a bit further than they were expecting when they got involved in all of this. And that as a result, the same lines are being said with a little bit of fatalism and a little bit of resigned, yeah, I know, but it's too late now feeling to them. So the vulnerability is definitely part of that.
I think I get that. I think that the version on Perfect Prescription, the way that Jason's vocal comes out to start with, the fact that it kind of comes out in the darkness, the music anyway, and this, like I said, sort of desperate sounding vocal starts. But by the time he gets to the well bit in the chorus, it's like he's almost found his mojo and his confidence is there.
And then towards the end, after the sound of confusion, sound of love, when suddenly it goes into here it comes, and they're done slightly higher, slightly more gently, almost as if his attention has slightly gone away from the fact that he's meant to be telling this story now, because everything is kicking in. It feels like an absolutely literal, here it comes. You know, excuse me for a moment, I can't give you my full attention sort of thing, really. Also in this version, there's an absolutely fantastic instrumental gap between the very first sound of confusion,
There is, yeah,
sound of love. And this is the sort of thing I was saying in our first episode about, you know, perhaps Peak Ember's influence is perhaps to push them a little further with some of the drone and the repetition, perhaps a little more than you might normally. I mean, I've listened to it so many times, especially recently, that I can now predict when it's going to come back in. But if you're a little less familiar with it, it feels like you'll be listening to it going, surely now, oh, surely now. And it's a lot longer than that, really.
Yeah, there's never any rush.
No, exactly.
Well, not that kind of rush, anyway.
So those are my two favorites, I think.
I would go with you on the Perfect Prescription version because it was the first version that I really fell in love with, and that album had such an impact on me anyway. But then I go back to that the first disc of Forge Prescription, just because it's so different. His vocals are so different. His even the tune is slightly different at times during the chorus. There's something about that. I actually, which know which version they would have put out if they hadn't thought about replicating it live, whether that might have appeared first. I don't know. It's a question for Pete and Jason.
Yeah.
Should ask them.
That is a lovely one on that first Force Prescriptions disc, and I do love listening to it. But I think in terms of the way I've tried to explain it, it doesn't quite feel like it's coming from that deep place of someone who is living what they're saying. Although the way you've described it makes me see that in a different perspective, because that's meant to be, if you're saying that's everything's worked out fine.
Yeah, he sounds comfortable.
It's the blissed out version. Yeah. Then fair enough.
But then they were very good at that. Spacemen 3, the kind of juxtaposition of, Feel So Good is the perfect one. Is it heaven or is it hell? I do feel good, but I ain't going to die. It's which way am I going to go?
Well, Walking with Jesus was a live staple for a lot of Spacemen 3 performances, and someone who was involved in a couple of them was local Northampton musician Pat Fish, main man of the Jazz Butcher, who'd been making music for a while before Spacemen 3 came along, still making it today, contemporary and friend of the band. And Pat very kindly spoke to us about some of the connections that he had with the band and this song in particular. You went to the recording for Sound of Confusion, and they said that they did a version of Walking with Jesus there that didn't quite work out. Any memories of that, or any other bits of that recording?
I don't really recall them having a go at Walking with Jesus at that session. I mean, it's quite possible that they did. I was there for 2 or 3 days. I remember them. The first thing they did was Losing Touch with My Mind. I can recall that. And that was quite fractious. That took a little while to settle in. But my chief memory of that session is the deal with Roller Coaster. And they started recording that and grinding away on A. And Bob Lamb, the producer, his missus came in and asked, "Did anyone want a cup of tea?" I said, "Yeah, sure." And so she went piling off to make tea. And the Spacemen kept grinding away, no vocal or anything. They just got it down as an instrumental. And she returned some considerable time later to find them still grinding away on A. And she stopped, stared through the control room window at what was going on. And then she turned around to me with a look of some bafflement on her face. She just went, "They're really into what they're doing, aren't they?" Yeah, that's my abiding memory of that session, was just that moment, because it did kind of sum things up, you know.
I remember Pete saying from some of those sessions that there were a couple of people in the studio actually saying, are we really doing this? Are we really making an album? Are they really recording this music? They were just kind of totally incredulous. Thankfully.
Yeah, I don't think Bob really knew what he had on his hands there.
No. Well, I think that album. I'm curious that you've said that that they asked you to produce that. Would have been fascinated to have heard that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'd have done that good a job, honestly. I mean, I was young and overexcitable myself. I might not have done too well.
Yeah,
I don't know. I mean, when you see the progression to Perfect Prescription, I could imagine myself working on that. It's just impossible to say, isn't it? I mean, they didn't have very long. I think they only had 5 or 6 days. As they say, it is what it is.
Well, in late December '87, they played a gig at Northampton Arts Centre, and you do the vocals for Walking with Jesus on that. Do you remember how all that stuff came about?
No, I mean, we were hanging around quite a lot in those days. There was the 3 bands. There was our lot, there was the Spacemen, and there was the Perfect Disaster. And we were all kind of in and out of each other's houses with each other's tellies, And they were playing this Northampton date. And our saxophone player, Alex Green, his missus, Jasmine, ran the venue. So, it was playing host. 1 week it would be our lot, 1 week it would be the Perfects, 1 week it would be the Spacemen. So it was all very sort of pally. And you didn't get big audiences either, because it was way out on the edge of town. So it was almost like a little private club sometimes, And so I guess we thought, there would be no harm in letting Fishy have a go at Walking with Jesus. And I was very excited about it. I really thought I was going to be Otis Redding or something. I mean, I've heard the tape since.
Well, it's
I was
quite an
listening to it earlier
exceptional recording, really, because apart from, the difference of having yourself on the vocals, and I think Alex is still playing the sax as well.
Yeah, he does some sax on the show, yeah.
He also does the sax on Come Down Easy, which they opened with, and it makes it quite a special version, really.
Yeah, it's nice.
No, it's lovely.
Yeah.
Is it? I gather it's a bit of a strange venue. There's no separation between the stage and the audience.
No, you're just in a corner. You're literally in a corner of the room. We did a show up there one time around about that time, and the Sand Kings opened for us. And lovely lads, great, quite good little band actually, but boy, did they leave a mess. By the time we got on that stage, it was like 3 inches deep in lager, yeah. I mean, it was like I say, it's quite a casual thing. You didn't get huge audiences. You'd get like the faithful sitting cross-legged on the floor, but you wouldn't. It wasn't really a proper gig in a way. So yeah, we would fool around and cross-pollinate,
Would that have been a song you think that they would have asked you to sing, or was that one that you particularly liked and would have chosen if you had a choice out of the set?
I may well have chosen it, given the choice, but I rather suspect I was just invited to do that one. There was always a thing about me and Walking with Jesus, and I don't really understand it because I think, as you pointed out in writing somewhere, it existed before I met them. But they had a version that wasn't the single version. They had another version where Jason was much more prominent on acoustic guitar. And I always remember Jason calling that the Jazz Butcher mix.
Has that ever appeared on any of the subsequent?
That's a very good question. It might be on Taking Drugs.
Well, whatever their reason for getting you to do that one in Northampton, it must have stuck with someone, because when they had the get-together for Natty at Hoxton in 2010, you did it again with them then. Things very different by that comical time. What about that day?
Well, that was a beautiful day. Were you there?
I was there.
I went to the Sheffield one where there was sadly no reunion, but it was still a great do. But I'd love to have gone to the one in London.
Yeah, there was a lot of love in the room. It was really nice. But the difficulty that came to pass there, and I mean you can see it on the YouTube version, is that we get through a couple of verses, and I think, okay, get out of the way, let the guitar players go. And Mark really went. Mark went haywire on the guitar. He came blazing in. And it was fabulous. And I wasn't about to stop him. I wasn't about to come in and cut him dead. It's not my place. And so on he went, and on, and on, and on. And just about the time I'm thinking, well, listen, sweet Lord. Sonic just looked across the stage, nodded his head, and stopped the whole thing. Never got to finish it.
You can't really see it on the YouTube thing because of the angle that the guy with the camera is. But I remember I was in the middle, fairly near the front, in the middle, looking on at you. And I remember when they stopped, you sort of looked around to Pete and the others in a sort of, oh, aren't we doing the last verse then? Sort of look on your face.
Yeah. In the past, I'd never really got my head around the final bits. Those wings are going to fail me, but I could have done much worse. And I'd worked that up. I knew where I was. I was going to sing it properly this time. And then it stopped.
But Mark and I were talking in a previous episode when we were talking about a gig they did. It was Rose Club in Cologne.
Oh, in Cologne.
It's a great recording of a great gig, and we were talking then about the version of Roller Coaster they do, and I don't think this was unusual for them back in the day anyway, that they would get so into what they were doing they might forget exactly where they were, because Roller Coaster's got 3 verses, and on that occasion they only play one of them. They go on and do so much of the thrashing around on A that by the time they finished, they hadn't really got started. And you're right, Mark does go for it. He goes on for quite a while, doesn't he? But that's not unusual for a Spaceman type event. They could have carried on for another 5 minutes and let you finish it off.
I'd have thought. But no, I was knocked out by Mark that night. He was raging, and it was really funny as well that night because people would come sneaking on, you know. And there was there's a big fuss about Kevin Shields being there and everything. But I remember Dean from the what do you call them, the Kool-Aid Electric Company, just sneaking on with a guitar. You know, people. Seriously, I mean, he stayed there for the rest of the night, I think.
It's weird with Kevin because I remember looking over at him and it reminded me when I saw him when he was touring with Primal Scream as well. Similar sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
You'd look over him occasionally and it looked like he was doing stuff that was nothing to do with what was going on. Like the tempo of his strumming didn't seem to fit in with anything else. But whatever it was just ambience, background stuff that seemed to work pretty well, I thought so. And
Yeah,
it's
he's
interesting
clever,
what you
yeah.
said about there being, a lot of love in the room, because one of the things about watching the clips of that gig on YouTube, there's a lot of smiling going on stage.
Yeah, in fact, in the audience too.
Oh,
You
yeah.
can see it. It's just there is a good atmosphere. It does look like a great night.
And it's lovely to
No, it's a super night.
see Will in particular looking really made up, which of course he should do because he was really responsible for the whole thing, wasn't he? He was doing so much stuff.
He was doing the kind of little tour. I mean, I obviously hung out a little bit when he did the thing in Sheffield, and I think there was some music that night later on, but we had to split a little bit earlier. But it was him that was running that, and I think it was good. I think he raised quite a bit of money as well.
He did a lot of good stuff in actually around that time, wasn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, Will's a tremendous force for good, actually. I mean, he did very similar thing for me after I'd had my cancer treatment. We had a little thing down here. And yeah, Will's a real, he will get up and he will get his hands dirty for someone else.
Yeah. No,
he also loves to grin when he's on stage. I think Will looks so cool when he's playing. He really does. Last time I saw would have been when he was in Dead Skeletons, and it was exactly the same. He was just beaming the whole way through the gig.
Yeah, no, I love him.
Say that the gig where you sang "Walking with Jesus" was that December '87.
Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah,
December '87. So it was only the big European tour where they recorded Performance was only a couple of months later, and obviously fairly well known on that. Pete mentions "Walking with Jesus" and says that he wrote it for you, which, considering they'd already written it by the time you'd met, I'd always wondered how that kind of connection happened.
I think that's just Pete being dry. Why he thought anyone in the Milk Fed would get their heads around a remark like that, we'll never know. But it's kind of sweet to hear it on the record. It reminds me of a show I saw them do in Douglas Hart's club, Speed, on the Charing Cross Road, which I think would have been '87 again, actually, maybe early '88. And they were taking tremendously long time between tunes. I don't know what was up, whether he was fixing the keyboard or whether they were just tuning up or what, but they were taking really long time. And the crowd, they were on their side, but they're all hipsters, but in the old sense of the word. And they were all in on it, but they were getting a little restive. And I can remember about the third time it happened in the set, Pete just went to the microphone and he went, "Yeah, you don't see many bands with good gaps these days, do you?" There's a lot of humour about the Spacemen 3, that, because sometimes it's so dry, people don't clock it.
Well, fascinating stuff, and thanks so much to Pat. On the day that we spoke to him, there were a few little technical problems, which meant that by the time we did the recording, we didn't give him either a proper introduction or a proper goodbye at the end. So thank you so much, Pat. That was much appreciated.
Oh, it's a brilliant chat.
And what fascinating stories as well. I mean, of course, I wasn't around to see that Northampton Arts Centre show in '87, but as I said, when talking with them, was lucky enough to be there for the 2010. Well, as we said in the discussion, we shouldn't really call it a reunion, and it's been described as a reunion of friends on the Facebook postings, and I think that's how it was advertised at the time, which is a good way of looking at it. I mean, it's an interesting question as to what would actually constitute a Spacemen 3 reunion, but quite clearly you couldn't have it without Jason Pearce and Pete Kember, and since Jason wasn't able to get there for whatever reason on that day. That's not a Spacemen 3 reunion. Beyond that, you can argue about who else needs to be involved, but we've got to, I think, admit that was a bare minimum. But there again, do we really want or need a Spacemen 3 reunion? I would perhaps suggest that it wouldn't be the best idea, and that I'd rather people were getting on a bit better, as they seem to be these days, rather than risk it all for that. I mean, how lovely would it be if perhaps one of the guys came out and did some encores with the others on one of their dates or something? I mean, that would just be an absolute dream come true.
Or even just contributed a little bit on somebody else's record.
Yeah, well, we can dream, I suppose.
That would make me smile.
Yeah, but I think on the whole, most of this magic is best left where it was. But it was lovely to see Pat on that day, and like I say, I will never forget that look over when he realizes that they finished a bit before he was ready for them to carry on. And that was what they opened with for that gig, and then went on to do a Revolution and Suicide and encored with a nice sort of slow jam, which was, I thought, quite fitting, really, rather than just try and do another standard number from the old days. So it's really nice. Well, Pat's talked about some of the live versions, and we couldn't possibly go through a list of all of the ones that were done over the years. It was played so much, but we've chosen a few that we think are interesting in their own right. And the first one's one we've talked about already, because in our second podcast, we talked about the gig at the Mercia Park Leisure Centre, November 85.
That's right.
But it's worth going back and just talking about the Walking with Jesus from that as well. It's, for a start, it's the earliest live recording that I'm aware of being out there. And the fact that it's so raw and, again, tremolo heavy. There's no bass because it's just Pete and Jason and Natty.
God, they sound loud, though.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know whether this is because the hall was so empty, whether the echoing from the walls has part of it. But yeah, it does sound. I mean, people really missed out on that night by not being more in the audience. Yeah, it sounds ferocious. Jason really does, on this occasion, genuinely sound like he might have a bit of a cold. He sounds a little bit hoarse throughout most of it, but it doesn't undermine its power at all. One thing that I notice is that Jason's got some vocal inflections on it, which, well, you'll know what I'm talking about, Mark, here, although I'm afraid I might be losing anyone who's not a Hawkwind fan here. When Calvert's singing on Quark, Strangeness and Charm, and you've got a line like, Einstein was not a happy fellow. When he sings the fellow, the sort of first half is like a semitone higher than it should be, and the second half is a semitone lower than it should be. Which is an interesting inflection, although it gets a bit wearing when he does it an awful lot. And Jason's doing a little bit like that on some of the lines here. I think I'll be in company with all my friends. It's like an extra little bit lower down than it should be. And I'm wondering if that's intentional. I mean, they always denied having any influence or link with Hawkwind.
If they did have a link to Hawkwind, that certainly wouldn't be the Hawkwind album that I would say.
No, it's very untypical, isn't it? It's not one of the space rock ones. No.
No.
That's just what it reminded me of. It's an interesting inflection, but he does seem to drop that pretty quickly afterwards. It's also early enough, of course, that they're still singing the heroine lyrics as well. It's all, but it is that nice raw one, and it's played pretty much in that style for quite a lot throughout 1986. There's quite a few versions we could choose. I mean, the one that we've been listening to is from March 86 at the Reverberation Club. So this is the club that Pete Kember and Gav Wilson put on at the Blitz pub in Rugby. I mean, for someone like me, it's got this sort of mythical status. It's like Spacemen 3's CBGBs or something like that, really, although I gather it was just a small tatty room in the back of a pub, and that actually seeing it in reality wouldn't be that impressive. But because it's in this small room, and all their friends and all the other wild people from the rugby scene of all sorts of different persuasions were there, it's got a nice audience sound as well.
I think there's a kind of deeper sound as well. They've obviously refined things a little bit in the space of the 4 months or so, 3 months even.
Well, absolutely. I think that Mercia Park gig might be the last one before Pete Bain rejoined. He was certainly back by December 85, which is only a week or so later. And by now, well bedded in, you can hear that it's that bass is giving it that little bit of heft as well there. Jason's dropped the heroine lyrics, and they're gone for quite a while now.
Pretty powerful vocal performance.
It really is. He's not holding back. It's moving towards that more powerful 87 version that I like. Although, of course, this is still before they've recorded the. Oh no, wait a minute. This would be shortly after they recorded the Northampton demos, but before they went back and remixed it for a single. So yeah, I guess they are moving towards that heavier and guitar-led style. It's just lovely, isn't it?
Yeah, Jason not holding back. I mean, for people who haven't heard those earlier gigs, he couldn't half bellow when he went for it. It was amazing delivery.
And the same thing's true in the next version that we've chosen, which is from just over a year later. So we're now into March 87. And this is at the, now how do I pronounce this correctly? Can you help me out? Ancienne Belgique?
Probably guess Ancienne.
Ancienne Belgique, okay.
That's the one with the cool yellow poster, I think. Is it?
It is, yes, with the Alice in Wonderland mushroom poster, yes. So this is from their first little jaunt to Europe. Just a handful of dates. It hardly counts as a proper tour. I think it's 5 or 6 dates. And it seems to have been a really interesting trip for them. A lot of the, well, from the ones we've got recordings of, there's a lot of good-natured stuff going on. They seem to have a really good crowd in for this one, who are really into them. But it is a gig where they are beset by the infamous Spacemen 3 technical problems. There's lots of broken strings and tuning up. And this version...
And apologies.
Yeah. And they do need, on this occasion, 2 attempts to get through Walking with Jesus. And that's one thing about them. Every time they started a song again, which they always seemed to do when it broke down, it didn't seem to matter how far through they got. They'd always start again from the beginning. But this is also fun because, you know, Pete's having a bit of chat with the crowd beforehand. And in fact, you know, I hope it's not too frustrating for anyone listening that we're talking about all these recordings and then we're not playing them. I mean, we're not really wanting to have to get through the grey areas of clearances with music. So the plan is really not to do that. But I can't see that anyone's going to be able to have the copyright on chatting between songs. So here's how Pete introduces a song that time.
This next one then is for you volume addicts. A hard-hitting mainline injection.
Get that out, get that out.
Sorry about that. We've got broken strings. This next song we're going to do for you is about a dream. I had a long dream yesterday, interspersed with pieces of reality. So this is about that dream. Sorry about that, I think we've broken the guitar string. Sorry about this. I've come here to do a lot of apologising tonight. Right, I'll try it again. Anyway, I was telling you about this dream.
It's probably worth saying on that tour, Pete told me that I don't think they had any official t-shirts made. They turned up at a load of the gigs and half the audience had made their own shirts, which just completely blew them away.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. Well, that was about that dream, apparently. We haven't really chosen to go through many 1988 versions because there's one that many people will know very well, of course, which is from the Melkweg, from the Milky Way in Amsterdam, that was released as part of Performance. And I know that's always been a favourite version of yours.
I love that version. There's something about it. It does everything which that track is meant to do, but then the beautiful little wah-wah solo at the end, the way it just kind of squeezes in is just lovely.
I mean, the previous one we were talking about, you can see that why they were doing that at February 87 rehearsal that I love so much. They've been rehearsing for that mini tour and it's really full on and it's you know, massive drony guitars, and again, Jason really shouting it out. But by the time of the performance version, it's not quite perfect prescription. It's not that laid back, but it's like one of those intermediate on the way down.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really like the How the Blues version, I suppose, is a model for it.
It is a bit. There's something about the keyboard which kind of links to that, but the way the keyboard just bleeds in at the beginning of that is fantastic.
Well, someone else who got in touch via the Facebook group was Matt Walter, who also has a particular liking for this version.
You know, I thought it was interesting when you put that out there about Facebook, about that song, Walking with Jesus specifically, because I do agree that it's probably their most iconic song. And I think that shows because they revisited it quite a bit throughout their careers, and it sort of evolved a little. Some of the versions are a little different. Take the one from their first recording, it was, a bit bluesy, all the way up to some of the spiritualized versions that are just so much bigger. So I was sort of propelled to respond because I agree with that being the case. And I think the band would maybe agree as well because of how often they revisited the song. And it's also has a special place in my heart because it was the first Spacemen 3 song that I ever heard. The first one I heard was from the Amsterdam live performance, and a friend of mine had put it on a mixtape, and I was, at that time, I think this was like maybe 90 or 91, and Spacemen 3 were certainly not a well-known band in America at all. They weren't on any of the college radio stations, or 120 Minutes was a popular program on MTV that played indie and alternative and things like that, and they weren't on there. So that version was, I would guess, it's probably not the first version that most fans probably have heard. I don't know. But yeah, a friend of mine had made it, put it on a mixtape, and I said this is like 90, 91. I was late teens, and I was really into like Velvet Underground and the usuals, Jesus, Mary Chain, and that sort of thing, And so I think sonically it was like there, hearing this song was there. And I've always been in the simplistic, simple music, but this, like, it's really hard to describe it. Just, I'll never forget hearing that for the first time and just really being blown away. And I was like, what is that? And it led me on a path to fandom, I guess, you know what I mean? And pre-internet, not easy to find a lot of information. So like, I really didn't know anything about Spacemen 3 until information started to come out via the internet. All I knew was what I had heard. It was amazing. I mean, they're a great band. They've come to be one of my favorite bands. It was the first song I ever heard, so that always holds a special place to me. And I think it's definitely their most iconic song.
Cheers, Matt. Thanks for braving the time zone differences to help record that for this episode. Well, we're very lucky in that something has come to our attention only in the last few days. In that, I know that much as you've always loved that version, one of the things that you found a little frustrating was the fact that it fades out rather than stopping.
Yeah.
And what's come to light to us recently?
Well, to put it in a nutshell, when I ran Runcible Records, I ran it with a close friend of mine called Pete Coyne, who I'm still very good friends with, who now runs something called Starside Records, a little bit more reggae orientated, but Pete just loves good music. We formed Runcible Records. We specialized in Spacemen 3. Then Pete moved to Cornwall. I moved to Yorkshire, and he carried on doing his own thing. I kind of stopped doing Runcible, but we stayed in touch. And he ended up buying a record collection from a guy called Pat Skinner, who was a sound engineer on the 88 tour. And as part of this collection were some Spacemen 3 cassettes. I hassled Pete this week because I knew we were doing the podcast today, and I said, is there any way you can get me the Walking with Jesus versions from that, particularly because one of the tapes that Pete had was the Melkweg tape. So we just 24 hours ago heard the full version of that Walking with Jesus from the Melkweg, which I don't believe is actually out there anywhere. And in this version, shortly after the fade out, the organ packs up, again with apologies from Pete, who says they're going to play something else, but he basically says the organ's packed up because of the abuse it's had throughout the show.
Well, I've just said about how we're not planning to include music in this, but that is only a final few chords on the organ and then Pete's chatter. So I don't see why everyone shouldn't be able to enjoy that. Here we go.
Absolutely.
Sorry about this. Sorry, we'll do something else. The organ's gone out of tune through being abused too much. You didn't notice, but I can tell.
Well, how fantastic is that? I mean, I think I should make it clear when you say it's the Melkweg tape, it's not the master copy of Performance.
It is a tape. There's a lot missing, such as bass and bits and bobs. I don't know quite what generation cassette that is, but it does at least show us what happened after the fade out.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it? And we're hoping that we'll have a closer look at all that in the not too distant future. And the thing I'm interested in, apart from listening to it, of course, is the fact that it seems to suggest that the running order on some of the release versions isn't quite the running order that it actually happened in. I mean, particularly the Tang one, which is trying to reincorporate the 3B3 extra tracks, and not entirely sure if they're in the right place. I think from the way that Pete says, we'll play something else, but it really was going to be, I think, the final number. And I think that what they do is just drag out repeater. That's not the first time they've played it live, but it would sort of fit the bill as to, oh God, what are we going to do? Oh, I'll just drone away for a little bit. So, but yeah, how interesting to hear that. I think I'd long speculated that it probably faded out because of a typical Spacemen 3 collapse of the song somehow.
I think I had in fact heard that something went wrong with the equipment, and that's why they needed a fade out. And for anyone getting excited about these cassettes, this is something which I think we will come back to at some point. We are yet to hear the full versions or the full performances on these, but
I wouldn't expect anything revelatory because there are quite a lot of recordings from that 88 European tour. And the reason why we weren't going to talk about it in any real detail is because they're all pretty much the same as a performance version. I mean, they're lovely, but there's not a lot of variety. It's not much to get more excited beyond what you would have already heard on there. So, we live in hope, and it'll be interesting to hear it. I think just so that people don't get super excited or get their hopes up, these tapes just seem to consist of a couple of other dates from that tour, which I don't believe are currently circulating, but I don't know that I've got everything. And as I say, there are a lot of them already circulating. So if, like me, you've occasionally sat down and gone through these things, you do get perhaps into half a dozen of them and go, I've heard this, I need a bit of a break now, come back to it fresh in the future. But, we live in hope.
So obviously a big thanks to my old buddy Pete Coyne and to Pat Skinner for supplying us with these oral delights. Thanks, guys.
Extremely grateful to both of them. I mean, people who made all these recordings at the time in any context are sort of our heroes in retrospect, but these ones are particularly nice. It's someone who was involved at the time as well. There's another one that was a little earlier than this, which you should have mentioned since we're talking about the on the stage chatting. The very first date on that 88 European tour at the Rose Club, the gig that we talked about in our first podcast, they don't play Walking with Jesus in that. It comes in pretty quickly in the tour after that. But someone does call out for it towards the end. And this is how that goes.
Walking with Jesus!
Jesus isn't with us tonight.
Why not?
He's doing some solo gigs. He's doing a few solo gigs tonight.
So yeah, that amusing stuff. Nice one, Pete. After that European tour, they do carry on playing for a few dates on a short UK tour when they came back, but then it largely gets a break from the set. Of course, we haven't got every live recording they made, but we haven't really got any evidence of it being played between April 88 and March 89.
Which is great because I saw them for the first time in May 1988, just after that tour. So even though I saw Spacemen 3 5 times, I never saw them play Walking with Jesus, ironically.
If you just hung on or been to a few of those later ones, I think it comes back again on the following European tour so this is the April-May European tour of 1989.
with revised
And
lyrics again.
well, in this tour, the heroine lyrics appear to be making a comeback on pretty much every version I've heard. I don't think on everyone, on the vast majority of them, it's in at least one of the two places it was. No idea what Jason's motivation for that was. Maybe he's just a bit more relaxed about it. Maybe it's the fact that they're away from home and that no one will care quite as much. Most of the versions that they play on that tour don't really sound very different from the way it was being played previously. I mean, there's a slightly different dynamic going on, of course, because we've now got a new lineup. We've got Will's bass and Johnny's very regimented rhythms keeping it going there as well. But there is a particular exception, which I think is quite lovely, because when they return to the Rose Club in Cologne, right at the end of April '89, for whatever reason, they ramp it up and play a big fuzzed up version again.
That's right.
It's far less gentle, and that's really lovely. There's a full recording of the '88 Rose Club gig on YouTube, but for the '89 one, I don't believe there is, but there is the version of Walking with Jesus is on there, so we'll put a link to that. And it's just really nice. You can feel as well the band. You may remember, if you listened to the second part of our interview with Mark Refoy, when he was saying that on the day that Pete Kember invited him to join Spacemen 3, he said that Pete had grown. It's just that extra confidence that comes with, having had a bit of success and knowing what you're doing and being happy with it. And I sort of feel a little bit the same about listening to this performance. It's like a band who have always been pretty confident, but now they know they're completely on it. And it's very assured, and just good to have a nice fuzzy version from that era where it's mostly still fairly gentle. The crowd are wild that night as well. You don't really hear it just on that Walking with Jesus. It's elsewhere between the songs. But my God, it sounds boisterous in there.
There is a version from that tour that does appear in the Live Europe '89
That's
album.
true.
I can't remember which gig that comes from. You probably know that.
There's that version that's on Spacemen A Go Live in Europe 1989. That's from Dornbirn in Austria.
Right.
In fact, a few of the tracks from that gig, apart from the Walking with Jesus, the I Believe It, the Lord Can You Hear Me, and the second version of Suicide are all from that gig. I did manage to track down where all the other ones came from, but that's a little bit boring for this podcast. Go and read that page on the website if you like. The last one that we've chosen to talk about is from just after that European tour.
It's a month on from the Rose Club, isn't it?
It is, but it's only 4 days after the last date they played in Italy on the European tour. So considering they had to get home from partway through Europe and find their way back to wherever they were in between, ending up on the 30th of May '89 at Waterman's Arts Centre, and they've reset it again. It's like it's being modelled back on those really gentle organ demo versions. In fact, the organ almost sounds like it's gone back to a one-note drone. Whether it's just the recording we've got making it not being particularly clear, I don't know. But when you hear most of the ones on the European tour, even the gentle ones, the drums and the bass, they're pretty full on, whereas they're quite subdued here. And it's all very gentle. This was the gig where Pete Kember asked Mark Refoy if he'd joined the band.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And then he sort of said, and then afterwards just watched the gig and was amazed by it. But I gather it was a slightly strange occasion, and that there was a very, very long time spent sound checking, trying to get a particular sound right, and that things were getting a little frayed. But the performance is lovely.
Did they play Walking with Jesus at Reading?
They didn't. After this, there's a very short UK tour. Haven't got many recordings of that, although there's one from Bristol, which
Subterranea was the pre-Reading one, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And then when they do the Subterranea as a warm-up for Reading, it's played then. And of course, that's the only recording we've got of Mark playing his guitar bits over it. And you can hear it's made a different, his sort of trademark shimmery style is coming into play there, and it's gone back up to being a bit more up tempo, not completely ferociously full on, but it's a bit more jaunty again. But there wasn't time in the slot they had at Reading to play everything they would have done in a normal set, and that's not one that made it. So the Subterranea is the last performance that we get, until of course that is 2010, where Pete Kember and Mark and Will and Johnny and guests get to do a version there. But we've already heard Pat tell his story of what it was like at that time. Well, I hope it hasn't been too tedious hearing us just talk about the one song for the time that we have, but it's such a special one for us. And once you put the idea in my head, we just had to pursue this.
I suspect there might be others we might highlight.
Well, if we have forgotten any versions, incidentally, if anyone's aware of anything special, please let us know. I had this sudden thing in the last 24 hours when I had in back of my mind. Surely there's a version that sounds, and I won't bother describing it, but a little bit different. But I think I'm just going walking with Jesus happy, it's
well, we have played quite a lot of versions of this over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
It's worth saying I've seen Spiritualized play Walking with Jesus many times, and on many occasions he's taken a completely different tack and reinterpreted it. There was one time it was almost like I hate to use the term line dancing, but it was like a country rock. It had a little bounce to it. It was absolutely delightful, and I'd never heard it played like that before. I don't think I've ever heard it played like that since, but that's the beauty of a song like that. If you choose to reinterpret it, goodness knows you wrote it yourself, you can do what you like with it.
Well, it is one of these songs which has been central to Jason's work after. And I think he was so taken with it at the time. He did some interviews where he was saying how happy he was with it. I mean, this is Jason in Magnet magazine from December 98. It says, Pierce in particular remembers it as being the first I wasn't writing songs that were based on anyone else's songs. So Walking with Jesus was purely about what I was doing. I was kind of shocked to see the lyric written down. And hey, that's exactly what I was feeling. Yeah, I really want to do this, to write songs. So you can see why he stuck with it since. And you're right, there have been lots of different spiritualized interpretations. Our friend Andy Black has been having a look at the post-Spacemen 3 versions. So here's something that he's put together for us.
The thing about Walking with Jesus is, to me, it's always kind of been in some ways the perfect Spaceman record, because it's clearly obviously half Pierce and half Kemba, but to me at least, I assume Jason wrote the lyrics because of the Jesus reference, but then it's kind of got Kemba's monotone. There's only like a 2-note organ that goes all the way through, and the bass line goes all the way through the same. So you can see how it's there to pulse and pulse and pulse. And it's that bit where repetition becomes blissful. But on top of that, you've got the chorus, which is just kind of just short of a pop song almost, in terms of the fact that it's a really catchy chorus. So I've always kind of thought it was kind of the perfect halfway house between all of them, part of all of them. And then, of course, like, it's obviously mutated a bit over the years. So I think Jason returned it to his live set in about 92, I think, because obviously he's on, there's the Fucked Up Inside CD, which has got it on that, which is, by that time, it's what, Mark Refoy, Sean Kirk, Johnny Mattock. And that version was always glorious because Johnny's got all these wash of cymbals all over it. And then I think I saw them play it when he had the Ladies and Gentlemen lineup. And by that point, Sean Cook was putting harmonica all over it. And Michael Mooney was playing bass. And then it's continued live. So obviously, I think there's footage of Pete Kemba's played it multiple times, but he does a stripped back version. And there's a video on YouTube of him doing it with Guito from the Super Furries. He's tapping away on a tambourine in the background. And then, of course, 2010, there was Hoxton Bar and Grill. So Pat Fish covered it. And of course, it was written for him in the first place. So I kind of like the way the song has continued to mutate a bit over time, whether it was an acoustic mainlines version or whether it's Pete doing a really rocked out version or a harder version, really, last time I saw him play it. But I think the way that it continues to mutate and change a little and evolve, really, I think is probably the best thing about Spacemen 3.
Cheers, Andy. Great to hear about some of those versions. Of course, as you say, Jason can do whatever he wants with his own song, and some of them have been really great. I have found it a little challenging listening to them when the bass line's been changed too much. I remember watching the Glastonbury 2004 on TV, and I'm afraid I can't remember who was on bass there. I'm very proficient, but he seemed to be very much doing his own thing. And I just couldn't quite settle into it because it wasn't bouncing along the way I wanted it to. But what I really did love was the way that Jason played it on the acoustic mainlines tour.
Yeah, that was lovely.
Yeah, I think the whole of that tour worked really well from my point of view. And that was a real highlight, possibly because with Spacemen 3 songs, I like the fact that the Spacemen 3 way of doing things pretty much is that once it's got going, you know what it's going to sound like for the rest of the song. Whereas Spiritualized, of course, seem to be far more about dynamics and changing tempos and that sort of thing. And it works with many of their songs really well. I think I'm probably too precious about Walking with Jesus, in that I don't like it speeding up and slowing down. So it was nice with the acoustic main lines. It was more on the one tempo. Plus, I just think that the whole atmosphere of those gigs imbued a lot of these things with some extra meaning.
Well, particularly after what had happened before with Jason's health and all that kind of thing, to see him back on stage with so many musicians, everybody enjoying themselves. The atmosphere at those, all of those gigs that I saw was absolutely terrific.
I only saw the one in Brighton, but it was phenomenal. And I'd managed to avoid reading anything about them in advance because I wanted to be surprised by every song. And it was so lovely to have some Spacemen 3 things in there. And the Spiritualized ones came out wonderfully as well. I was extremely lucky to see that. I'm pretty sure the Brighton one I was at was being filmed, and I know that at least one of the others was professionally filmed. But although there were rumours of some release, nothing's actually come of it. I think with the Brighton one, unfortunately, one of the guitars went out of tune right at the end, and that would definitely have scuppered any hope. You couldn't have salvaged that. It was on one of the, what did they do right towards the end? Good night, and the strumming is sort of picking through. It's the only bit of instrumentation going on. And it was so conspicuously not quite right that it rather undermined it. But not the night, because it was wonderful. And as you say, yeah, there was that extra element of just seeing Jason again.
It was the adulation as well.
And seeing him looking all right. Who'd have thought you could waffle on for as long as we have just about one song, but it's such a special one to us. Thanks very much again to Pat Fish for his time. Thanks to Annie and the other guys for all the little extra bits that people have contributed. We're not really sure what we'll do next time, or whether we'll get round to it a bit more quickly than we did this time. But thanks very much for listening. We've been Spacemen Pod.
Good night.
Good night.